Welcome back, panelists here. Yamiche Alcindor, moderator of Washington Week on PBS, and of course, an NBC News Washington correspondent, former Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson, Stephen Hayes, editor of The Dispatch, and USA Today Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page. Susan, the comment, the ad-lib heard round the world, literally, walking it back, saying it, everybody seems to agree, was not the right thing to say at the moment, but everybody's thinking it.
Well, true. Though a Washington gaffe, as we were saying, where you accidentally say what everyone already agrees is true, but distracting. What are we talking about today? Not the impassioned defense of democracy that the president delivered, but his final 9 words, where he seemed to be calling for a regime change. Distracting, undisciplined. And we'll find out whether it is dangerous, whether it is damaging, whether it causes some kind of reaction from Moscow that would not have been coming just as a result of calling Putin a butcher and a war criminal.
Quite the walk back.
It's quite the walk back, and you have the White House really making it very clear that he was not advocating regime change. You had Secretary Blinken come out in Israel also saying that. But there's also a sense that this was a window into what President Biden really thinks and feels. This is after he was holding refugee children. This is after he has met with all these people. And this is after he called President Putin a butcher and a dictator. So in some ways, the logical conclusion, apart from, of course, official U.S. policy, would be the average person thinking, of course, he should not be in power. That said, it is distracting, as Susan said, because now the White House and Republicans, you see Rob Portman calling it a mistake and others jumping on the idea that he made a gaffe.
I'm going to dissent. I'm not sure I would have walked it back. He's a war criminal. He's slaughtering innocent men, women, and children. He illegally invaded Ukraine, and he has got command and control of nuclear weapons. Such a person should not remain in power.
So he's lost his legitimacy, in your mind?
More than lost his legitimacy. And at most, I would have modified the statement by saying it's not a statement of our policy, it's just simply a statement of fact. But, you know, I'd like to see us at some point get to a place where we're not constantly disclaiming the line over which we will not cross. And he said it, you know, presidents every once in a while do say things that ad-lib. Reagan was famous
Evil
for this.
Empire, right?
Evil Empire.
That rattled their cages, right?
The bombing starts in 5 minutes, remember that?
Yeah.
So it was a statement of fact. Virtually everyone agrees. Everyone in the Western world agrees.
Yeah, I think everything the Secretary says about Vladimir Putin is correct. I mean, clearly, he shouldn't be in power. It's one thing to say something true. It's another thing to wonder whether it was wise to say it. And this does, as Senator Portman points out, play right into Russian propaganda about the U.S., about the West, about NATO. You know, they have long made the argument that NATO is an offensive alliance that represents a threat to Vladimir Putin, represents a threat to Russian sovereignty. And the U.S. has said, no, that's not what we're about. This seems to, I think, feed that. And that's a concern. It also has a domestic effect. If you look at the number of times that President Biden has had to walk back things on this trip, 3 significant statements on this trip alone, and then you go back further and talk about his comment about a minor incursion. He has said things repeatedly that show, I think, the lack of discipline that some people had about concerns about President Biden or Joe Biden as a candidate.
And, you know, that may be one reason you have that incredible 71% number in your new poll that Americans do not have confidence in President Biden
I was surprised
to handle the situation.
By the size of that number.
That includes some of his supporters. That includes a fair number of Democrats. And the idea that White House officials, first anonymously and then the Secretary of State, have to come back and clean something up, I think reinforces the idea of does the president, can we trust him to respond in a competent way to this war?
Of course, never happened during the Trump administration.
Well, it's particularly concerning when you think about the fact.
We're numb to it, by the way, as a public these days. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, it's particularly concerning when you look at that 71% number and think that this was the president who ran on the idea that he was going to come with the A-team, he was going to come with all this experience, and now Americans are saying we're not confident in your policies. I think it was also interesting that in this poll you saw the domestic politics at play when it comes to thinking of who do people blame for the inflation and prices. They're not blaming Russia. They're blaming President Biden's policies. That also is something that is in some ways concerning to White House officials.
Well, I looked up the 1942 midterms didn't go well for FDR and the Democrats, for what it's worth. We are sometimes always about our pocketbook, Jay.
Yes. And as my friend, the late Andy Kohut, used to say, when it comes to polls, with all due respect to NBC, it depends on how you ask the question. if you ask Americans the binary choice between the economy, i.e. my wallet, versus something else, they're almost always going to say the economy is more important.
Yeah, and yet the president's focus actually has to be on the war, Steve.
It does. I mean, it has to be on the war, and I think part of the reason that he's struggling on the economy is, one, we're not seeing any improvement, and two, he's not willing to do the kinds of things that I think both with respect to the war and the economy that might actually help. I mean, if you talk about an all-in energy policy that would address some of the things that we're seeing come out of Russia and potentially forestall some of the inflation, he could make the case, but I don't think his base will let him.
Look, I want to bring up that you brought up the poll numbers and President Biden on the who do you blame on inflation. I just want to put it out here because, you know, the most generous way you could look at it, Susan, is, well, only 38% blame President Biden, and a majority blame something else. But that's about all you can do. What's interesting is that only 6% blame the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that was a specific thing the president said.
Well, and of course, inflation was becoming a problem before Russia invaded Ukraine, although it's clearly jacked up gas prices and had some other effects. But this is of great concern to the White House. You know, 3 of the last 4 presidents have lost control of the House of Representatives in their first midterm election. And is there anybody in Washington who doesn't think that's going to happen in November?
Well, it's funny, and Yamiche, I'm going to put up our generic ballot test here. And the public's going to look at it. You'll see 46-44, Republicans up by 2. Oh, that's not. That's a coin flip. This is the first time we've had Republicans leading on the generic ballot in our polls since September of 2014, 8 years ago. There's always a little bit of a Democratic average because there's more Democrats are more packed in some districts here. This is a huge red flag.
It's a huge red flag, and it is coupled with the idea that people are blaming President Biden's policies for inflation. It's coupled with the idea that Americans are still very, very concerned about how much they're paying for so many other things, not just gas. And that also is, I think, part of the reason why when you ask people right now, they're essentially saying that Republicans are the ones who they trust with the economy. That's going to be a hard thing for Democrats to overcome and to message about.
Yeah, well, in this gas issue, it's a regressive tax because it impacts people harder, farther down the socioeconomic ladder.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.